Welcome here at the auditorium of the Pinakothek der Moderne, here to the audience in the room, but also at home at the live stream of our YouTube, the Brandhorst, Museum Brandhorst YouTube channel. Welcome all of you. And I would also like to welcome Lucy McKenzie. We just opened, as you all know, the very successful exhibition last Wednesday. Welcome here to Munich. Thank you very much, Lucy, for the big honor to do your first retrospective, your first overview over your work since the late 1990s here in Munich at the Museum Brandhorst. And I would also like to welcome the curator of the show, Jacob Proctor. As many of you know, he worked for more than 2 years at the Museum Brandhorst, and he went back recently to New York, to the Smithsonian Institute. Thank you very much, and Jacob, for curating this exhibition, and we wish you all the best for the future. As you can imagine, it was pretty difficult to mount this exhibition. All the preparations were extremely difficult in Corona times. So I would very much like to thank the whole team, everyone from the Museum Brandhorst. Only the enormous commitment of everyone made it possible that this exhibition opened in time, and also the catalog. Thank you very much, the whole team here of the Museum Brandhorst. And I would also like to thank the sponsors of this exhibition. First of all, the PIN Friends Circle of the Pinakothek der Moderne and the Museum Brandhorst, and the company HeyPix. I'm very much looking forward now to this conversation. It will last over roughly 1 hour, and afterwards you have the possibility to ask questions here in the room, but also I would like to encourage you at home via our YouTube live chat to post questions in the chat, and Monika Bayer-Wermuth here, our curator in the room, will take the questions and ask it for you here to Lucy and to Jacob. So have a nice and beautiful evening, and I hand over to Jacob and to Lucy. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Achim, and I also want to just reiterate my thanks to the whole team here. This was truly the most difficult exhibition that I've ever worked on, and I'm very grateful to everybody on the team for all the help that they gave. We could not have done it without you. And also thank you to Lucy for being here and for making this possible by making all this work. We're going to just jump right in. This is an installation shot of the room of the earliest work in the exhibition. And I thought we could just start by talking about where this came from, where these two bodies of work came from, and where where it all began.
So the image you can see here it's not a recreation, but it's a hang which is very similar to my diploma show when I graduated from Duncan of Jordanston College of Art in Dundee in 2009. No, 1999.
1999.
And I think it works really well in the exhibition to have this hang, which is done in what is kind of called like a salon hang, or what I thought of a bit more as like posters hanging in a bedroom. And my time at art school was, I played in a band for the first year at least. I had to go back down to Glasgow every weekend to practice and play live. And so I came out of a background of kind of pop culture, music, youth culture. And when I started to make paintings, somehow that just continued in terms of the source material and the way that I wanted to show them. And I combined it with my, learning about art, learning about painting, being especially interested in painting. And in 1997, I went to Karlsruhe, the Kunstakademie there, on an Erasmus exchange. And I knew I wanted to go to Germany. I'd seen the work of people like Martin Kippenberger, Kai Althoff, the Cologne artists. And the time in Karlsruhe I spent traveling to Berlin and to Munich and going to goth clubs and seeing all this work that I'd never... It was being somewhere different from your hometown. All artists know how important this is, to just go somewhere else, to understand that the water that you usually swim in is not normal. Like if you go somewhere else, you realise what is considered kind of tasteful or normal back home. And so to be in Germany where there was just a very different history of painting, relationship to painting, and I kind of brought all this experience back to me in Dundee. And I also, during my studies, I made money by being a life model. So I spent a lot of time doing nothing, just standing or sitting completely still for hours in the evening after school and getting paid for it. And it's a great job, you're appreciated, it's pretty well paid, and you have all this time to think. And I remember I would just sit there for hours and just think about ideas and think about problems and do all this kind of problem solving while doing nothing, and then just get back on my bike and race to art school and make this stuff very, very quickly and efficiently because I'd kind of worked all these things out in my head. And there was just these discarded abstract paintings, either lying about on the corridors or in the rubbish. I was lucky to live with an artist, a girl, Lucy Henderson, and she gave me, or let me have, and gave permission, sometimes didn't give permission, to take her things out of the rubbish. And I knew I couldn't make an abstract painting. It just wasn't in me. I didn't have that relationship with painting. And there were these kind of ready-made, lovely works. So I made this series of works where I did text overlays over the abstract work with these flyers for these clubs that I'd been to in Germany. And at that time I was really into this kind of Gothic, or a bit like Welle, I think you call it Welle in Germany. Is it Welle? Wave? Deutsche Welle. And it was great to be in Germany, where you could go to a nightclub in Munich where they played a remix of Enjoy the Silence by Depeche Mode that lasted 24 minutes. Which you definitely couldn't in Dundee. So I made these works that was about this kind of overlay of these two different experiences of German painting, British pop culture, and these works kind of embodied something that was just totally different from the work that was being made back in Scotland, that was very kind of cool and conceptual and precise. I mean, people like Douglas Gordon were really big, and everything was very, very serious.
And how did you start using sort of the international sports and Olympics and that kind of iconography? How did you come to that?
So again, from being in Germany and picking up these old East German kind of sports albums and magazines, I had gone to Romania on a family holiday in 1989 when I would have been around 12 or 13. And this was an incredible experience because, again, it was being somewhere that was completely different from where I knew, and you couldn't get all the things that you thought were really important to you, but nevertheless had a wonderful time with my family. And my parents had met people who had told them that something was happening. And so when, at the end of 1989, when Ceausescu fell, when the wall came down, I already had this kind of direct experience of kind of geopolitical politics through this holiday, and it had just engendered a kind of lifelong fascination and interest in how art and culture and the politics of the former Soviet Union. I found some like old leotards secondhand and started wearing them to go clubbing and to play music in, and collecting these images. And I think I knew that I was interested in making work to do with history, but it seemed important that that history shouldn't be mine. It shouldn't be a kind of personal history. And so this idea of this kind of international sports and all the politics that were connected to it just seemed like the most fertile subject to explore how the construction of history and history in connection with geopolitics, sexuality, aesthetics, style, design.
Right. I mean, this image that we were just looking at previously is from and it's interesting that you tended to choose games that had kind of fraught political histories rather than, it's not the games that were uncontroversial. It's the Munich games, the Moscow games, the Los Angeles games. But then when you come to a work like Top of the Wheel, and you are inserting yourself into this history, it's also the first moment, in a way, that with a presentational strategy that has continued really until today. Were you sort of conscious of this sort of collecting of evidence and sort of presenting it in this kind of fictional framework at that point? I'm thinking of a work like this is a recent quadlibet painting. There's almost 20 years separating these two works.
Well, in this case, I don't know how self-conscious it was, but it just seemed like a logical extension of, it's what my bedroom looked like back home. My apartment was wallpapered with kung fu posters and, whatever I could find lying around. And so hopefully it made that connection between sport and pop culture by presenting it a bit like something that would be done on a teenager's bedroom. But of course there is this connection to, say, the sociopath's mind wall or the detective's evidence board, which is a trope in TV dramas and films. I don't think it happens in real life, but there's definitely a connection there.
And it seems also with a lot of the Olympic work that it's significant that it's history, but it's history that's mediated through the mass media. It's not history that you were participating in. And then pretty quickly you got, and it's public. It's history in the public sphere. And pretty quickly after that, you started thinking about art in the public sphere in a kind of more literal sense, in terms of art actually how it's functioning within society, with a work like Global Joy 2 from 2001. How did you come across Walter Womacka in all of this?
Well, growing up in Glasgow in Scotland, Glasgow is somewhere that shares certain characteristics with more socialist countries, the former Soviet Union. The whole remit of public art had really had echoes of the kind of public art that you would find in socialist countries. And Scotland, the biggest employer is the state. And I was definitely educated at art school that I would never in a million years ever make money from art, that we were educated to be able to write about our work really well, to document it, to apply for grants. So we were kind of being primed to enter a system that was kind of non-commercial. And of course, all the murals in Glasgow were all a bit kind of faded by the time I was really looking at them in the 90s. A lot of them were made in the 70s and 80s. And again, spending time in Berlin. I lived there for a little while in 2001 and saw the Haus des Lehrers, and the Palace of the Republic was still there. And I just thought they were incredibly beautiful. I thought they were really great pieces of art. And so found out that the artist who had made the mosaics on the Haus des Lehrers was Walter Womacka, who'd been an extremely successful and popular artist in East Germany, making things like prints were made of his paintings that then were really popularly hung on people's walls in domestic interiors. So I wanted to do something that was about it's something that's continued in my work as well, that you have a friction between the idea of like state-sanctioned art and subcultures, where in a way that's where I came from, but I was fascinated by state-sanctioned aesthetics and all the kind of problems around that. So I wanted to do something which combined the two and tested the limits of the polarization of it.
And can you talk a little bit about the sort of the interventions in the iconography? Because of course it's inspired by this, both of these paintings are inspired by Womacke's work, but they're not copies of it.
No, it kind of took on the composition and the line, the gesture of that kind of work, but then the figures depicted are all meant to be people from a subculture. A lot of the figures I took from a postcard from this great theatre group in Berlin called the Die Ratten 7, who were a theatre group of homeless people. And then on the side you see the teenage daughter Betty of Gerhard Richter. And of course Gerhard Richter had worked in East Germany and had done public art. And then I had this record of like a counterfeit Sonic Youth record from Russia, where the cover had been designed by Gerhard Richter, or it depicted a painting by Richter with this photorealist painting of a candle, and in the counterfeit record they just use a photo of a candle. And I just thought this was so brilliant that you replace photorealism with a photograph. So all these things kind of folded into the painting, but I used the stylistic composition of a Soviet era painting.
And then you also were looking back home as well at the same time, approximately the same time. And these two paintings are based on a pair of murals at the Glasgow School of Art. Yeah,
I never studied at the art school in Glasgow, but my father taught there his whole working life. And these are replicas of two murals that are on the side of what used to be the Haldane building, and they were kind of where you would stand when you were queuing up to get into the kind of student union at the art school. So it was somewhere that you just spent so much time sitting around, like before and after, and waiting to see where the next party would be once the band finished or the nightclub finished. And I always found these curious murals because they looked so corporate. It was a kind of postmodern architecture that I find so much more, you associate more with the interior of a bank or Wall Street or something. So they seemed extremely incongruous for an art school. And certainly by the mid-90s, that style was just so completely out of fashion. There'd been such a kind of radical break at the art school from like the 80s to the 90s, this rejection of painting and the introduction of environmental art, it was called. So in terms of like local aesthetics and local kind of art tribes or kind of discourses, they seemed interesting to me. But I depicted them without the graffiti, as that felt important to kind of restore them.
To restore them to their original postmodern form as they were created in the 80s?
Yeah.
I mean, and Scotland also, muralism had played like a significant role in the kind of urban development in Scotland in the 60s and 70s as well, but these postdate that. These weren't sort of like the muralism that was patching up kind of holes in the city that had been created by like new motorways and things like that. These were just a sort of odd insertion into the landscape.
Yeah, they were done in the 80s by a former student at the school. I can't remember his name, but now destroyed. And they were shown in an exhibit. They were made to be a kind of counterpoint to this painting here, which was made for a show in 2003 in Berlin. And shall I explain the background, or you want to say something?
Yeah, well, I think you can explain it just as well as I can, but this is a painting, it's called If It Moves, Kiss It. And what's interesting about this painting is that this is a painting based on a mural that was kind of only created as a piece of set design. This is based on a mural that appears in the film A Clockwork Orange. And I think you can maybe you can tell the story of how you, like, sort of how you came to this as an interesting sort of piece to work with.
Yeah, well, so first of all, in the early 2000s, suddenly you could, like with DVDs, you could, like, get screen grabs. When I made the work with all the Olympic posters, I'd had to, write to the Olympic Committee and got a VHS of the opening ceremony of the Moscow Olympics, and then had to take it to the IT department at the art school and get this special print out of the screen. And then suddenly with this DVD, you could just, like, screen grab and see all these things. It was amazing. And knowing very well the book and then the film of A Clockwork Orange, and this decor that was made for the film, it's in the hallway of the apartment where the protagonist Alex live, which is meant to be a kind of failed dystopian, like, failed social project. You've got this brutalist architecture, and the murals covered in graffiti. So it's meant to show the kind of, that they're from this kind of, in this urban squalor. And the thing that really caught my attention with the mural was that the graffiti was just so odd. The graffiti said things like, lovely. And I thought, maybe this is a really intelligent comment by whoever these people were that did this set design, that in this future, in this dystopia, even graffiti doesn't mean what we think it means today. And I found that, like, who knows if that's true. There's been so much written about the art that was used in Kubrick films, the people he worked with in Clockwork Orange, people like Alan Jones. But this could never find any information about who made it. And of course, I find that super interesting, all this kind of cultural production, all this painting that's being made, but not really credited, which relates also to my interest in the applied arts and other forms of painting.
This is also a piece of art that appears in the film for like 30 seconds.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think that's also somehow telling us that this tiny little, I mean, it's such an inconsequential detail in the arc of the story, and yet you managed to sort of mine it for all of this much deeper content.
Well, it seemed to be something that could perfectly symbolize the kind of conflict of, like, any subculture, any kind of resistance is, like, necessarily tied to whatever it proposes to be against, and it's always this kind of double bind of a relationship. And I thought this image said that really well. And then subsequently found out that it was actually based on existing Nazi murals. So the smart set decorators who had got the job to make this mural, they'd seen this image in a book about art of the Third Reich. I didn't even know that at the time. It was after the project a friend sent me this photocopy, like, yeah, you know what this is. So yeah, it made sense.
And of course, this interest in public space and the way that art functions in the public space has a lot of different sort of directions that it's gone in your work. But advertising and sort of you mentioned that the fact that if it moves, because it was essentially just a piece of set design. It wasn't like an artwork per se. It was decor, and your interest in sort of blurring or kind of challenging these boundaries between different kinds of art forms is, you said it really eloquently in the proposal for this project, which is it's a proposal for a public art project, and maybe you can talk a little bit about the context that you came up with this piece for.
Yeah, I was approached in around 2004 to do a proposal for a piece of public art in Düsseldorf, and the location that was kind of suggested to me was an area of like a little square that was really being, like, gentrified, and they were trying to kind of encourage it to be this kind of new destination with restaurants and everything. So thinking about, okay, what is the purpose of public art? Is it purely to kind of lubricate this process, or can you do something against it? Can you intervene in that? And I decided I wanted to make an image that would function as a bit of looked like a piece of advertising in this place that was trying very hard to be extremely chic. So I would try and make a bit of advertising that just really didn't look like the kind of thing that would imply that this was a kind of up-and-coming, groovy neighborhood. So I decided to make this image for a product which, of course, doesn't really exist, advertised in a language that doesn't exist, showing a kind of 60s, swinging 60s, twiggy kind of girl with such delicious armpit hair, because she uses this hygiene product that all the boys want to eat her armpit hair because it's so delicious. Thinking about the language, the way that the women's movement, or, you know, all these kind of movements of the left in the 60s, just how easily they were incorporated into the language of advertising and in consumer culture. So the image should look like somebody that's had a mood board with all this kind of feminist protest signs and, yeah, the new liberated woman, but to sell a hygiene product.
Yeah, obviously this project was not accepted for this public artwork, but what was the response of the jury at the time?
I don't know, but it was sort of rejected with prejudice. It was they considered it like a kind of an insult, I remember, and I wasn't sure why, but
because in your I remember in the proposal that you wrote, which hasn't been published, but you say that you were very eloquent about the way that we live in a space that is structured by all kinds of different visual communication, essentially, and that you sort of give equal weight to state-sanctioned art, to graffiti, to advertising, and it was, I think, it didn't come across, in hindsight at least, as a sort of ultra-critical gesture to them, but I guess maybe they were more conservative than we give them credit for.
I have a big folder of rejected projects and angry rejection letters. I'm proud of them.
So another piece of unauthorized advertising, this one is also hanging in the museum right now, but this was made for a very different context.
Yeah, I was approached to do a project in a museum in Ostend in Belgium called Museum. And the great thing about Museum is that the museum is in a former, not really department store, but a former kind of cooperative supermarket / department store. Wonderful. It looks like the MoMA. It's a really fantastic building. And my concept for this group show was that it would function as kind of everything would work as advertising or products, and it would be forward facing so that the audience could see it from the outside, especially at night. And I invited about 6 artists all to make things that could function as kind of intermediary objects between advertising and products and display. And this was, so all the paintings I made for it were on the scale to be like big banners of like advertising.
And you could only see this piece really from outside.
Yes.
It wasn't a piece.
Yeah.
It was a piece that was made. It's their canvas, but they weren't originally intended to be seen in an interior space.
No, and especially the back would be seen. I always like when you can see the kind of frayed edges at the back and the workings. And
unlike Kone, this, which is a made-up product with a made-up name, this is actually a real product that you kind of took it upon yourself to rebrand.
Yeah, this product, Moon Cup, it's been around since the 30s. It's like a silicone cup that's washable and used for your period. And I thought this was just such an amazing product, but I always found the packaging and the kind of promotion or the branding for those products really unpleasing. This kind of slightly insipid, bit bio, eco, unthreatening, kind of nice. And so why does a bio product have to be in pastel green and pink? And so I decided that the subject of the paintings would be setting myself the task of like rebranding this product and giving it a bit of sexing it up a bit and giving it some, I don't know, make it more pop.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting.
More explicit.
Yeah, that in both Kone and in Mooncup, and quite different with a kind of different valence, you also use. They both have this kind of 60s kind of sort of pop sort of visual language to them. But in Kone, it's very clear that it's a critique of the appropriation of that language by the advertising industry in particular, and the kind of culture industry in general. But then in Mooncup, it feels much more, it sort of gets back a little bit to the kind of what you've described in a few occasions as sort of the fan fiction element or the sort of the fandom in your work, in terms of actually really like a kind of enthusiasm for this product.
Yeah, and I would never kind of dare to try and, in a way, like depict a real person. It's always about trying to absorb or reinterpret these kind of made-up female identities or identities in general. I would also say that with the Mooncup, also from using it, as a painter, you realize what just incredible material period blood is. It's so beautiful when you pour it in the sink. With mix it with water, it goes kind of yellow, cornflower yellow around the edges, and it's just the most wonderful paint. So it's also a bit of a comment on painting.
Yeah. And in the museum here, it becomes a kind of giant movie poster as well for the video, The Girl Who Followed Marple, which is from 2 years later. The painting is from 2012 and the video is from 2014. But this whole rebranding that you made features quite prominently in the film, along with your own Atelier EB branding.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of like to set myself these parameters or limits, okay, it's a film, but it should be like an advertising film. So what happens if it has to use that kind of language? Or because if you think about fashion illustration, it's meant to kind of show things a certain way in these poses, so immediately that it's a fashion illustration because it's kind of conveying a certain kind of data. If you see these, they make very, very elaborate promotional films for Chanel and Dior, and they never really work as films because everything has to be through this kind of posing language of fashion, and you can read right away what it is. So what is it about that language that limits it or makes it special?
And that question of sort of typology and or sort of data also plays out very much, or comes out. It wasn't there so much originally, but it develops out of your interest in architecture as well. And I mean, these are two of the very earliest works that you did that kind of dealt with architecture and with Charles Rennie Mackintosh in particular. Can you talk a little bit about how Mackintosh sort of functions for you?
So in Glasgow, Mackintosh, I wouldn't say he was rediscovered, but a lot he kind of became incredibly popular in a kind of mass way in the late 80s when it coincided when Glasgow became the European capital of culture. And that moment is really still held up as a kind of bit of a template, because before then people thought Glasgow was this dangerous, dark place, and then suddenly they realised actually it was incredibly beautiful and full of world-class museums and great artists and theatre. But the evidence of that was suddenly this kind of proliferation of all this stuff. We call it Mackintosh, so fake Mackintosh, so mugs and tea towels and jewellery. And I just loved all that as a kid. And in America it's called Frank Lloyd Wrong. And there was a thing in the 90s in Glasgow where there was something I didn't feel part of, which was how do you identify what is authentic culture? And in Glasgow at that time, somehow football ended up being this kind of vessel to symbolise authentic culture. There was artists making work about football, and I remember being invited to be in a group show where they would say, and also we're all going to play football together. And I was into Macintosh, and it was for me symbolized by this like Macintosh jewelry. You could get all this super nice silver jewelry. It was an industry that actually completely like reinvigorated the silversmithing industry in Glasgow. And I wondered, okay, so why is this stuff considered like inauthentic trash, but football isn't? And that's no disrespect to artists who want to make work about football, but like it was definitely this gendered thing of like jewelry is not real culture. So I definitely engaged with Macintosh from loving it, from knowing it as a child through my dad, but really through this kind of mass market transformation and these kind of questions of high and low.
You also started using Macintosh, and I mean, among other architects, and thinking about the different modes of architectural presentation, like different kinds of drawing. You mentioned fashion illustration a minute ago, but you know, architects have various kinds of renderings that do different kinds of jobs. There are schematic drawings, there are kind of conceptual studies, there are presentation drawings. This is a drawing by, or it's a painting by you, based, which is quite large, almost, but not quite life-size. And it's based on a drawing by Macintosh for his design for the Willow Tea Rooms. And how did you come to that sort of practice of using, of blowing up these kind of very delicate watercolor presentation drawings to be these large-scale canvases?
Well, it was always about context, and I'm happy that you show this one as well, because what was important with these two examples you've shown is that they're like shown together. Macintosh is just a supreme draftsman. He's as an architect, he's like remarkably gifted as an artist and as a draftsman. And then you have an interior like this by Paul Hankar, who's also a wonderful draftsman, but this drawing like functions slightly differently. If you see in the top right-hand corner?
Left-hand corner.
Left-hand corner. There's this kind of little corner of red. So, of course, the intention with this drawing is that pattern would continue like right across the room. You see there's a vertical stripe of red, and these are just like indications for whoever is like reading this drawing as data, as information, like how all the room, the design should look. But it's just this wonderful economy that you just put in a little bit. And, you know, I've always been a big fan of comic books and dolls' houses. I had, you know, many dolls' houses as a child that I constantly redecorated and redrew the paintings for the walls. And so for me, the kind of delight in seeing the connection between like a Tintin illustration and then like an architectural illustration, and then just the desire to blow it up really big, to see how it feels to be in it.
To be in it, as it were.
Yeah, to be shrunken down, but to think about within something like Art Nouveau, arts and crafts, you have these kind of variations of drawing. So what happens when you put them all together? Right,
because these two drawings, I should say that these two paintings, as well as two other paintings, form one larger work where each wall is comprised of is a drawing or a painting based on a drawing by a different architect of a different space. And so, but they're all existing spaces, and they create this kind of set-like atmosphere within the gallery. And this piece was completed in 2007, and then shortly afterward, you decided to go back to school and enroll in the Van der Kellen Institute in Brussels, which is a specialized school for decorative painting with a curriculum that has essentially remained unchanged since the early 1880s, correct? And there you learned all kinds of techniques for trompe-l'oeil and architectural painting and the representation of wood grain and marble and, you know, millions of different decorative motifs, or not millions, but lots of different decorative motifs. But you also learned a kind of new way of working, and that I think comes out quite strongly, like in this piece, which is sort of in a similar vein with the Macintosh and Hankar and others, But here, instead of reproducing an existing drawing or a single existing building, here you've created your own building. And so how did that work?
Well, so firstly, to study at the school, it was just a realization that I'd completely reached the limits of my own skill with the things that I wanted to do. And I'd been working for several years kind of inhabiting other styles and from other periods or other artists. So it would just be so beneficial to have this kind of toolbox of techniques and experience and skills to really be able to kind of ground it in also like the 19th century and the kind of birth of the decoration starting to be something which is kind of studied and ordered, books like The Grammar of Ornament by Owen Jones. And this work here was made after the school, and it was, a bit like you do all this study, you kind of, you sketch, you blow them up really big, you see how it feels, and then you try and make your own. And then you kind of take it to the limits of what you want to explore, and then you put it to bed and move on.
Yeah, it's interesting that after several years of kind of working through other people's work, you kind of inhabiting, in not just inhabiting their style, but inhabiting a system. And then by the time with Ludwig House, which for the audience is comprised of details from lots and lots and lots of different buildings. It's a kind of amalgamation of like a kind of idealized bourgeois Brussels townhouse. And that by the time you've figured out how to do it yourself, and how to make it really technically precise, which is another, you can't really see it in the slide, but it's really employing very professionally all of these techniques. Then you sort of just were like, okay, that's it, I'm moving on, I'm going to do something else. But architecture didn't leave entirely, because this piece, which is from 2013.
Yeah.
Is which was made for a completely different exhibition. Ludwig House was made for an exhibition at the Museum Ludwig in Cologne, and Loos House was made originally for an exhibition at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. And here we've juxtaposed them quite intentionally. Do you want to talk a little bit about your sort of relationship with Loos?
Yeah, I won't go into all the details of like the original context that this work was made for, but just to say it's a kind of scale replica of the marble portions of the Villa Müller in Prague, which is a house by Adolf Loos, widely considered to be one of the most beautiful interiors in kind of early 20th century modernism. And there's so much mileage to get out of Loos. He was such a complicated and kind of unpleasant person. His ideas, this kind of idea of like his treatise on like ornament and crime, it still kind of travels. I have a Google alert for Adolf Loos. And like still every week there's all these articles coming through, ornament and crime, ornament and crime, ornament and crime. So yeah, we were happy in the show that we could kind of put him between like a huge blood flow and moon cup on one side, and then the most kind of degenerate ornament you could imagine on the other. He's kind of forced to confront things that he really didn't like. Primitive, feminine,
and polychrome decoration.
Absolutely.
Also coming out of the Van der Kellen Academy, you encountered, or within the context of Van der Kellen, you encountered this format, the quadlibet painting, and which is a particular genre of still life painting with a long history. And it was one of these student exercises, and you just took it and ran with it. I mean, this is a genre that, in the context of the school, was an extremely conservative undertaking. It's essentially a technical exercise.
Yeah, the coursework was to do like a door knocker on it. But I ended up doing like, postcards and keys and stamps, and I just totally loved it. And quodlibet is a still life which depicts the kind of accoutrements of working life, like a desky stuff, and it should be totally inorganic, so not like a still life with grapes or peaches, but it should be all this kind of glasses and pens, and maybe you could have a feather in there if you were going to really push it. And I'd often included in exhibitions, and you'll see them at the Brandhorst, like vitrines with this kind of like working material. I've never been someone that was kind of anxious to kind of keep the working process hidden or mysterious. And so I'd found this form where you could work with all this like stuff. I'm always dealing with stuff. And you could depict it, but by rendering it in oil paint, it showed you were really serious about this stuff. And it could be about, you could tap into this wonderful history in trompe-l'oeil still life painting, where just by putting two different objects beside each other, it could be the most kind of like incendiary gesture, depending on the kind of politics of the country or religion. And I realised that you could, in this kind of conservative idiom, there was actually all this elasticity of all these different types of things that you could talk about. You could make a really direct portrait of someone, or you could like this I did for an Atelier EB exhibition. Atelier EB is this fashion label that I do with a designer, Becca Lipscomb. And we worked with a woman who coordinated what she described as chronic knitters. These are home knitters that if they didn't knit would like smoke themselves to death. And she kind of coordinates getting them to kind of produce things for you. So this was like a pinboard just with all this material relating to her, like a map of Scotland where it was marked where all the knitters worked. If you think about this relationship between art and fashion, I always think of how art is so seduced by, the human body, the catwalk, the glamour, the immediacy, the mass culture importance of fashion. And when I wanted to engage, I wanted to like deal with the minutiae of manufacturing, the difficulties of distribution, but then also bring in the working process to depict in paintings, like the anti-spectacular.
Oops, sorry, I skipped one. It's also become, I think like in the quadlibet in your hands has become, as you said, has become a very elastic form. And so portraiture was the first thing that you used it for, either kind of self-portraits or portraits of friends and family members. But it pretty quickly also became a kind of a more argumentative, more like an essay, or like in this case, more like a kind of mood board, or a way of, this is relating back to like an early piece like Top of the Wheel, of kind of collating and organizing information or data. And can you maybe say a little bit about what's happening in this painting? And for those of you who haven't seen it in person, the entire thing is a painting. The frame is painted. The corkboard is painted. It's the paper. It's entirely a trompe-l'oeil construction. And what are we looking at exactly?
So it's imagining like the mood board of an interior decorator that has to design a fascist bathroom. So firstly, to think about, I want to think about how design and art connect to broader topics like politics, but what is a way to do that doesn't fall into the kind of seductive language of something like fascist architecture or design. So to think, well, even fascists had to go to the bathroom. What does a fascist bathroom look like? This private sphere? Were they also this kind of pompous and uplifting interiors? And so to imagine, what would an interior designer be like putting on their board to imagine that? Also to think about this kind of hierarchy between sort of like art and design or interiors, and the way that people always think that art, and the way it is, like art is like taken and put on people's mood boards to be kind of just consumed kind of stylistically into other kind of consumer products. This was interior decor.
And politics also, a different kind of politics, but sort of a more, but this piece is also, I know this is a piece that's very important to you, kind of personally.
Yeah, this is really important to me. It was the quadlibet where I felt like I tried to push the the polarity of like the form and the content. I sort of stretched them maybe as far as they could go in my hands. So it depicts a collection of objects that were all relate to practitioners who are extremely respected in their fields, and all are either self-confessed or convicted pederasts. So you have a glass by Adolf Loos, you have a sketchbook from Otto Muhl, a book by René Scherer, who's a French intellectual, the brother of Eric Romer, and part of that movement in the 70s to kind of legitimize underage sex as part of kind of queer or left-wing liberation, and a page with the typography Gill Sans made by the wonderful, the really talented and respected graphic designer typographer Eric Gill, who in his personal diaries discussed not only raping his children but the family dog. And a book by Graham Ovenden. Graham Ovenden is in prison today. And the idea was just to kind of, pull these things, like the form and the content, like how do you talk about those things which are so, like almost like not forbidden to show, but you have to find other ways to talk about them. I always think about this kind of controversy with the Dana Schultz painting that was in the Whitney Biennale a few years ago with this depiction of Emmett Till, and of course I followed all of the discussion around that a lot, and I just knew that that was something that I could never do with a subject which is just so emotional and incendiary. I would almost want to kind of refract it through a series of mirrors before it's kind of shown to the public, just because I want to kind of drain it of the passion. But it's still there. I mean, we'll have time to show this painting of a map of Glasgow, which depicts these kind of gang areas that were described by a young sociologist, and the things that this sociologist had to do to be in this gang, they're just so outrageous, but because he's describing it in this kind of sociological language, it gives it so much more impact because it's done in this kind of dispassionate, informational way.
But this painting, I mean, just in terms of the chronology, you were talking about Dana Schutz, but this painting is from 2014.
Yeah.
And I think it was, when I first saw it, at that point, I was, it was already, once I kind of figured out what the connection was between these objects, I was like, it gave, it's a very seductive representation of a very uncomfortable topic. But then in the years since you made it, I feel like, in terms of like the Me Too movement, this idea within has really gained a huge momentum within the culture that, this questioning of how much, or I guess the question is like, how much do we want to know, and how much should we know, and how much should it matter, the personal biographical details of people who are celebrated for their aesthetic achievements. And so this is almost, like in hindsight, it seems like it was almost predicting some of those concerns. But you've always had a more ambiguous or ambivalent relationship to some of these figures, I feel.
Yeah, but it's this kind of black and whiteness that you have to. We are all, compromised people, and we all have to kind of resolve how we feel about, all those artists and figures that we all admire and respect. But to understand that you don't necessarily have to like something to find it interesting or want to talk about it. It's not this kind of fan club. You can have like a sophisticated relationship with this material where it's not necessarily like in or out. Mm-hmm. And I think, I cherish that. Yeah.
And then the next year, this is, I think, from 2015, you made a series of quests. So this is also, you're almost like kind of challenging yourself in these paintings. Because after, 6 years of making quadlibets that are filled with printed matter, filled with painstakingly, or I guess as you've said, like once you know how to do it, it's not that hard. Yeah, but with very precise renderings of typography and handwriting, which then the audience gets used to. Then when we're faced with a painting like this, in which you've collaged actual printed matter into the context of a trompe-l'oeil painting. So everything around the pages is trompe-l'oeil, and then there's trompe-l'oeil painting over top of the pages. And were you consciously sort of trying to sort of undermine or challenge this idea that you had developed, this, like, not quite a shtick, but at least a kind of signature move of repainting documents?
Well, firstly, it's a bit like that thing of showing a photo of a candle instead of the photorealist painting of the candle. When I went to Van der Kellen, and then also subsequently with this fashion label I was involved in, just the culture changed the same way the kind of relationship with marble has really shifted since I started exploring it. It's like you've got to always respond to what's going on around you. And so this kind of shift and this kind of fetishization of craft, or this kind of return, like craft beer, craft coffee, this kind of, that things have just changed so much since I'd studied. And I just was getting anxious that this labor intensiveness, this kind of like skill and like this handmade thing, and, you know, the work coats, I was really worried that it was going to like put me into a kind of intellectual dead end where like it's just the most conservative thing, that somehow hours of labor equal value. That's absolutely not the point of art. I'm always in my kind of contrary position. I want to do kind of the opposite of what people think is like quality at the time. But in this case, yeah, I just thought, okay, the point of building a system is to then destroy it or undermine it, or to see what happens when you do exactly what is against what is kind of supposed to give it its raison d'etre or its value. So by, just like, instead of painting everything by hand, just photocopying it and stick it on to undermine that expectation. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, at the same time, and I know we're getting sort of toward the end of our time, but, you know, maps have been another sort of topic that has been run throughout your work over many, many years. But they, at around that moment of kind of, I mean, you've still been making quadlibets, but it's almost like with the Ludwig house, where you sort of figured out the system and then you moved on to some other things. The map has become a really important structure in recent years. I mean, we can talk about this map and then the map of Glasgow that you mentioned before, that are both in the exhibition.
Yeah, so this one not only connects to maps, but also to public art. Mm-hmm. It's a replica of a mural which exists in the train station in Ghent, in Belgium. And it's a mural which, the station itself was made in, I think, 1911 or 1913 in a very bizarre, like, neo-Gothic style. It looks like a little fort. It's gorgeous. And the murals inside depicted this kind of anachronistic, strange kind of Flemish nationalist, kind of neo-Renaissance medieval pageant image with Ghent in the background. But I noticed that they'd done some excavation and they'd removed a strip of the mural, and there was a mural underneath. And the mural underneath was a massive train map, or network map of Europe. And this for me was the kind of like the idea that you'd made this map for when the station was built in the early 19-teens, with the decoration of a map, with everything that symbolizes in terms of like belief in modernity and connectivity and the sort of optimism of the world. And then at some points they came and they made this super ugly, much more regressive, and also with the politics in Belgium and this kind of Flemish nationalism, which is very uncomfortable there. So yeah, it seemed like a good, like all I had to do was just replicate one-to-one this painting, and it says everything about kind of two different systems of public art.
Right. And this is a map that, I mean, it was completed in 1913 for the World's Fair, and it depicts, the transit system that it depicts stretches all the way from, you know, the southern tip of Spain and Portugal and the edge of France, all the way well into Russia.
Yes,
and
Samara.
then, of course, first it was, and then only a couple of years later, the First World War breaks out, and this map is already obsolete. And then at the point in the 1950s or 60s when this painting is overlaid on top of it, the Cold War has rendered that original idea of internationalism doubly obsolete. But I'm still so curious as to why they only removed just this one strip.
And then the painting itself was made for an exhibition in Venice.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about Venice as a context, the fact that Venice was a city that resisted fascism, so it couldn't resist fascism because it had such an established kind of bourgeois cultural life. And it's just a city which is considered, incredibly beautiful. And it's this crazy amalgamation of all these historical styles and stuff that's been stolen from different continents. And we read it as this totality, but it's actually this kind of crazy sediment of all these different periods and styles. And that really fascinates me.
And then this piece is also an overlay of one. In that case, it's an overlay of two different murals. In this case, it's actually two different maps. And this is a detail of a much larger painting, but this is the kind of central portion of two maps of Glasgow. And this was originally created for one context and ended up in a very different context.
Yeah, it was made as a commission for a public art museum in Glasgow that I just decided not to give it to them.
Yeah.
But
what it depicts is, it's kind of similar in that there's, as you started saying before, there's the map, the larger map, and the red lines are essentially the transit system as it was completed for the the Empire exhibition in 1938.
Yes, it's two maps. One, the tram, as you said, the transport system as kind of redesigned and expanded for the Empire exhibition of 38, overlaid with this kind of psychogeographical depiction of these gang territories of Glasgow from 1966. So it's just two different types of maps, two different types of readings of a map, and two different languages of the names of all these gangs are so great. Shamrock and Gestapo, Uncle, Porttoy, Wine Alley. The Empire exhibition of 38, really towards the end of the justification of the colonial project for Western Europe, finding even more and more sort of desperate and cosmetic ways to kind of justify it, which something like Art Deco is completely complicit in. And Glasgow is this kind of, by the time that the gang maps were done in the 60s, Glasgow was a kind of desperate, post-industrial, very, very kind of dangerous place to live, but it was meant to be the second city of the Empire.
And I think I know we're out of time, but I just wanted to talk about one last piece, which is one of the most recent works in the exhibition, and a work that's now in the Brandhorst collection, that, of course, includes this map. So a lot of your work includes representations of other works of yours, but this is very much part of an ongoing project. And so just maybe talk a little bit about this, and then we can open it up for questions.
Sure. I've, since working with my design partner, Becca Lipscomb in Atelier B, just developed a side hustle of fashion and a study of fashion, and looking at historic fashion, realised how important portraits are in the study of historic fashion, because before colour photography, it was one of the only places that you would find out really what colour a dress was. And then we did this ongoing project called Passerby, which was a show that travelled to several venues, and it looked at the relationship between art and mannequins and shop display. We were attracted to that because if you think about a phrase like just window dressing is a kind of pejorative term which implies kind of shallowness and kind of commercialism. We find that as long as that is a kind of antagonistic term to work with. And through the study of mannequins for Atelier, we'd kind of discovered certain things. You'll see in the exhibition the faux shop, which is this fake shop window. But we realized for our fashion label that we really didn't want to work with mannequins, that even though they're incredibly flexible and inspiring objects as components in art installations, their actual job of showing and selling clothes is very, very narrow. But aside from Atelier, I was developing my own relationship with mannequins. As I said before, I'm not really comfortable depicting kind of real people, but a mannequin isn't a real person. She's a hyper-capitalist body, embodying the kind of taste and styles of the period that she lives in. And she's also kind of a painting. Her makeup is painted. So a bit like taking the quadlibets and turning them into furniture, I also started to take like mannequins as kind of three-dimensional paintings to then like figure in compositions, which is plays of all these different kind of surfaces like marble or murals. I just wanted to, instead of doing these flat quadlibets, it felt like the next challenge would be to kind of take them into a real like pictorial space. But of course, I always have to do something that shows it's a kind of quotation and that it's a painting of a painting. So in this case, the frame is trompe l'oeil, to always say, yeah, this is not really a painting, it's a painting of a painting.
Yeah, it's a flat board. Well, thank you. I think we can open it up for questions if there are any questions in the audience. There's a microphone over here. I'm a little blinded, so I can't really see. I think it looks like we have a question from our YouTube audience.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for the insightful talk and the fascinating, to hear more about the fascinating works, and also thank you so much for the exhibition. And I think it's really wonderful to have such a so many insights into so many details of these 2 decades of art. And we have one question from the audience, and I think it's a quite unusual one, but I'm also curious to learn. And it's the question is: if you could choose, if you, Lucy, could choose one person who's no longer alive for a conversation, who would it be? And I also would add, why would it be then?
Well, it wouldn't be Adolf Loos, because he reminds me too much of so many guys I know already. God, what would it be? But what would you say to? Who would it be?
Madeleine Vionnet.
Yeah, maybe Madeleine Vionnet, but she'd be so modest. She wouldn't ever want to I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure. I don't know if I have an answer. I'm sorry.
I would like to record a conversation between you and Madeleine Vionnet, but you might not. It might not be your fantasy. Do we have other questions?
I'll try. I mean, I'll keep thinking about it. But more questions. I mean, I'd like to know who, the person who did the map on the wall in the train station in Ghent.
Yeah.
I'd like to kind of talk to them.
Yeah, I feel like actually the question would be, you would want to interview all of the anonymous craftspeople and all of the anonymous makers who have made all of these amazing things that basically structure the world in which we live.
Yeah, the person that had to kind of take a Macintosh drawing and go okay, is that really a flower, or is it a picture of a flower? What is that?
Is it on? Hello?
Yeah, it's on. We can hear you.
I saw the faux shop in Basel, and there were different clothes than now shown. So is there a set of clothes with the artwork, or is it always like are there always new clothes placed inside when you show the work?
So the work has a kind of suitcase full of clothes that go with it, but while we're still alive and have ideas, we take the privilege to be able to kind of redesign the window how we want to, and we made a special window for this exhibition in the Brandhorst. So we focused on work clothes. We have like painting coats because there's all the paintings around. So, or the connection to the Vanderkellen Decorative School, where I was taught to wear a white coat because it's a symbol of your status as a craftsperson, and instead of your like paint spattered jeans, you wear your coat as your sign of your identity and self-respect. So we have coats and also cigarettes.
And prototypes.
Yeah. Prototype, yeah. And there's some cigarettes in the window as well, as a kind of symbol of the now, kind of like the forbidden in a way, but the way that, advertising is, you're not even allowed to show cigarettes on public transport advertising anymore, like in magazines. So cigarettes are a bit of a connection to like the styles or the mores of the past.
Hi, also thank you from my side, very insightful and inspiring. Just I guess a curious question. You said you were commissioned for the map that you were depicting from different point of views, and you didn't end up giving it to the museum. When did you decide that, and what else did you give them? I mean, you were commissioned after all.
Oh, it was because we were working on this show Passerby, and we really wanted to borrow something from this museum, and they refused. I mean, for legitimate reasons, but I just thought, okay, like I'm making a painting for a museum and it's a public institution, and I didn't like the idea that, okay, maybe they're going to refuse to show it, like they get to decide. And I guess like a lot of people, I view public institutions as like, they're ours, they're public, and I was just got anxious about like, oh, what's going to happen? The thing we wanted to borrow, it hadn't been it'd been shown, I think, once in 100 years, and just thought, are they only going to show my painting once in 100 years? I'm going to keep it and do something else with it.
Yeah, thank you very much for this great conversation. I wanted to ask you, Lucy, doing an overview and looking back to 20 years, more than 20 years of making art is a challenge. And personally, looking back, but also aesthetically, like all the works spread over many places, and you did it for different contexts, and you didn't see many of the works for many years, and then seeing all them coming together again. Could you give us an insight in your in the last couple of weeks, like seeing the work again and seeing your system coming together again?
So yeah, I guess it was important that like Jacob curated the show. Having curated shows myself, I know what that involves, and somehow it felt really important to always say, like, I'm not the curator, I didn't choose, this is not my show. Kind of way to have a bit of distance, because I don't know how on earth I would do it if I had to curate it myself. But yeah, I'm a bit ashamed to say I hadn't quite realised just how much text was in the paintings. I didn't really realise that right from the beginning there's just text
everywhere,
like a plague. Yeah, I'm not sure why that is, but it's there. Certainly heartened to see that even though everything is kind of heterogeneous, there are things there that connect, whether that's like certain colours I like to use, or like there's a pair of shoes that turn up in so many different, like this, the same pair of shoes are in like the Olympic photos, so they're also worn by my cat. In a fashion illustration, they're on the mannequin in like, there's just these shoes. And these shoes are these like Czechoslovakian gym shoes that my Czech friends hate because they associate them with all this kind of mass ornament, like sports classes they did. But for me, having like started to travel in Eastern Europe in the late 90s, that time just for me symbolized like freedom and like just excitement about the world. So those shoes really are like, they're really important to me. So I'm happy to see them. They're even on there's a big pin board for Atelier with them even made out of paper. Yeah, so I'm happy to find that things kind of reoccur.
It's interesting that you didn't always notice that they were reoccurring at the time.
I didn't, yeah, I didn't.
Like you weren't
idea.
consciously saying, oh, I'm going to paint those shoes
No,
again, or
no.
I'm going to include this motif. It's like, it's really an unconscious kind of process in that way.
Yeah, and things like I hadn't really realized before about like in the early part of the exhibition, there's all these vitrines with objects, and then like after Van de Kelen, that shifts and it's just pictures of things in vitrines. And I even remember when I started teaching at the art school in Düsseldorf, one student said like, why do you have to paint it? Why don't you just stick the CD on the wall instead of painting it? And I hadn't even thought about why you should or shouldn't do that. So, question? Yeah?
Because when you were speaking about the introduction of collage into the trompe-l'oeil paintings, you said that you did that because labor was not the source of value, you know. And I'm curious what you think the source of value is.
It's many different things going in many kind of different directions at once. I don't think there's one source, but for me it's always about these like little sort of micro decisions that are always about kind of responding to the conditions of whatever the context is to work out like, okay, if I'm do the thing that I do here, is it because what's kind of expected? If I do this, is it going to kind of elevate and protect the product by showing it in the right museum? And this is why I also got interested in actually showing things like in vitrines, because vitrines are the device which lifts something up and shows that it's precious and that it's like for sale or it's, you know, has to be protected. So I also want to play with the kind of framing of even that concept. But somehow by doing it in like oil paint also just shows everyone that you're extremely serious about what you're. It may not be about the source of value, but it definitely it transmits hopefully to the public that you're like, you take this kind of seriously. If you've taken the time to draw this object, it's this kind of like push and pull between it being something casual but not. But like couture is meant to look like it's this kind of been blown together, but actually it comes from these like hours and hours and hours of labor, even if it's an extremely simple dress. And I think understanding that by working in fashion, you understand that, yeah, this kind of, all this stuff like under the surface, how important that is, whether that's just like the time that an artist takes to work on something, even though the object might be very, very modest, or it might be, yeah, these choices they make about their career and the kind of institutions they want to work with or people they want to work with, and there's all these micro decisions.
I have a question for Seit. Does the detail-oriented way of working take as much time as it seems? And does that then also influence how large or small your body of work is?
The detail, this is something I've mentioned to a few people who are working here, especially to the installation crew who kind of want to know how something's made. And when I explained that like something like this may look like it's like a huge amount of work, but it's really not. It's just if you know if you know the procedure, and you just like wait till things have dried properly before you start the next level, or you use the right kind of brush at the right moment, and it actually comes together. It's very, very like technical, but not in a really like sophisticated way. But just by doing it right, it kind of like comes together and it hides the labor. But yes, certainly the amount of detail goes into it, maybe like the size of like, but then I always sometimes choose to do like tiny detail on like a huge painting. Like, so it's kind of playing with those rules in a way, I guess.
Well, it seems like that's part of the Van der Kellen curriculum, is this kind of tension between, on the one hand, like the labor being kind of valued almost like for its own sake, but on the other hand, an emphasis on learning how to do things efficiently. And so it's the illusion of labor that becomes more valuable than the labor itself, because your labor is valuable because you have to do it, you have to be efficient and do as much as you can within the allotted amount of time, or within whatever the program assigned by the client is. It's much more of a functionalist sort of approach to what artistic labor would be than
which is also now like weirdly turned on its head, because like real marble is much cheaper than like paying someone to make fake marble now, because like marble just can be mined. It's just it's so abundant, and I'm very interested in the way marble has kind of re-emerged as this kind of like sculptural form in the last kind of 10 years or so. Excuse me. If you think about like, you know, things like Celine boutiques with all this like marble, or like, it's just really common now in these like high-end boutiques, which is also filtering now into more like mid-brand boutiques. But if you think about the way it's used, it's not being used in this kind of Trump, like Rococo corporate interior. It's been filtered through the language of like minimalist sculpture as a artistic form, excuse me. So I find that interesting, the way this kind of capitalism, or like the way luxury industries have then really filtered it through contemporary art. And I took up thinking about marble because, like, what does it represent? It's a stand-in for academy, for prestige, for history, for weight and establishment and edifice. It's meant to represent all these things. I would never work with real marble because it's a natural material. You don't want to like ruin the planet by mining it.
We have one more question from the online audience, a member of the audience, and it's by one of the catalog authors, Mason Lieber-Jaab, and they are asking whether you could talk a bit about how you came to the title of the exhibition.
Well, that's easy. It was Jacob's title, but I guess riffing on. So I published a collaborative crime novel with another painter, Alan Michael, and we called it Unlawful Assembly. And we'd realised that one of our favourite authors, Muriel Spark, like lots of her titles came from this kind of language of crime, like loitering with intent. And it's just, it was like very nice, cheesy way of kind of taking up this crime language.
Yeah. And hi, Mason. The title has a few different resonances. I mean, it's also that we have a shared love of crime fiction and mysteries, but it also is pointing to the way that your work often either includes sort of like puzzles or clues, or that, you know, either within a particular body of work, or in this case across the whole show, there's very much a sense of like needing to put together the pieces, as it were, to like find the clues, to find all the different representations of these Czech gym shoes, for example, and kind of make the evidence wall and make the thread. And it's also, you know, the title Prime Suspect, of course, is also a very famous British television drama with Helen Mirren playing Detective Inspector Jane Tennyson, who is like a very powerful and strong female protagonist in a very male-dominated world. So that also
and very flawed.
What?
Very flawed.
Very flawed, of course. Yeah, but it's also, and of course, I also felt in the way that you were the suspect. In some cases, you're the detective. In some cases, you're the suspect. You know, and that part of my task, I mean, in putting this show together, was to kind of follow you through this, you know, through all these different paths that you had taken, and where you're always like changing disguise and impersonating somebody else, and just kind of like keeping up with you and tracing you is also like part of the project here.
Yeah, and I've always been very aware of like the relationship between like the painting and the viewer. So I did a painting in 2005 which depicted a woman looking really fatigued, kind of eating dinner in a fancy restaurant, and there's a painting behind her which depicts a kind of pornographic cartoon. And this was based on a personal experience of being at a dinner at the Deste Foundation in Athens with Jeff Koons's Made in Heaven series as a decor, and it just made me start to think about pornography as this kind of art world backdrop decor. And so the figure in the painting, her kind of fatigue, I wanted to convey to the audience, like, she's you. She feels just as tired as you might, having all this stuff around you all the time, expecting to sort of socialize with Cicciolina's bumhole over your dinner partner. And so yeah, the idea that like there's somebody in the painting who's like telling the audience, like, yeah, we know what's going on, and that kind of left my work, but I side with the viewer. Mm-hmm. And in a crime novel, the way that the mirrored relationship of like the writer and the murderer and the reader and the victim is really palpable, and maybe there's analogies to make with the viewer of a painting as well.
Yeah. Well, if there are no more questions, I think that's a really nice place to end. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Lucy, so much for speaking with us. And I hope you all have a chance to see the exhibition, which will be on view through February 21st. This talk itself will soon be available online on the website if you came in partway through and want to see earlier, or if you want to just experience it all again. And that there's going to be a whole program of supporting of events and tours and workshops and all of these things, which can be found also on the Museum Brandhorst website. So thank you so much, Lucy.